Athens, 450 BCE. Under the rule of Pericles, the city was rising. Temples gleamed on the Acropolis, philosophers gathered in the Agora, and democracy flourished. But inside the stone walls of modest homes, another story unfolded, one the public never debated. By law, Athenian girls were married off before 15, often as early as 12. They had no say, no voice, no time. The same city that birthed political freedom bound its daughters in silence, and behind every marble column stood a girl who had already been given away. She stood motionless as the men discussed her future. The courtyard smelled of wine and olive oil, and her father's voice carried through the air like a judge pronouncing a sentence. In Athens, she belonged to him not just in tradition, but in law. The Kyrios, or male guardian, held total control over a girl's life. He could decide whom she married and when. The law said nothing of her will. It didn't have to. Athenian girls were raised to obey, and from the moment her body changed, the city expected her to become useful. The signs came early, a stain on her tunic, a sharp pain in her belly, and with them, the quiet withdrawal of her name from childhood. Puberty was not a celebration. It was a signal, and once that signal came, a father was expected to act. Pericles had reshaped Athens with policy and war, but he did not alter what lay inside the home. A girl's role was fixed: to marry, to bear sons, to disappear into domestic virtue. The law allowed her to wed before 15 because it saw her not as a child, but as a womb in waiting. Her father had already chosen the man, older, established, with ties to the assembly. A good match, they said, an alliance. She had seen him once, a passing glance at a festival, his hands stained with the ink of ledgers, his eyes sharp and measuring. When the wedding agreement was finalized, she was not asked for consent. She was told the date. The household buzzed with preparation, but she remained silent, caught between the memory of her dolls and the weight of the bridal veil she would soon wear. Her mother gave no comfort, only instructions. This was how it had always been. And when the sun rose on the day she would leave, her father kissed her forehead like a man sealing a contract. That night, another man would call her wife. The polis would gain a citizen through her, and she would lose whatever childhood she had left. She had heard the word citizen before she could spell her own name. It was spoken with pride by her father, carved into marble by the city, and echoed through the speeches of men who filled the assembly. But she would never be one. Citizenship in Athens was a male inheritance, passed down through the bloodline like a sacred coin, and it was her body that made its circulation possible. Girls were not raised to become individuals. They were raised to become mothers of citizens, and that role came with urgency. The law did not measure a girl's readiness by her maturity or understanding. It measured it by biology. When her body began to change, the city saw opportunity. If she could bleed, she could conceive, and if she could conceive, she could serve. This was not cruel by Athenian standards. It was patriotic. In a city constantly rebuilding from war, ravaged by plague, and surrounded by rivals, reproduction was a civic duty. Every girl was born into an invisible contract. Her childhood would be brief, her value would be tied to her womb, and her purpose would be fulfilled before most boys her age had even taken their first lesson in rhetoric. Pericles himself had warned of the fragility of the city, urging citizens to preserve the strength of their lineage. For that to happen, the line had to begin early. The earlier a girl could marry, the more sons she might bear. The more sons, the stronger the state. So 12 became common. 13 was expected. 15 was almost late. To refuse this path was to risk disgrace. To question it was to invite silence. There were no choices. Only the well-worn road walked by generations before her. She had seen other girls vanish into marriage, cousins, neighbors, playmates who once sang songs in the courtyard, and then were never seen again except at festivals. Veiled and bowed beside older men, their eyes held something still and heavy, like pond water that had stopped moving. She wondered if hers would look the same soon. She did not feel like a woman. She still dreamed of running through the hills outside the city, of climbing fig trees and licking honey from her fingertips. But the city had other dreams for her. It dreamed of stability, of future warriors, of sons who would vote and die for Athens. And for those dreams to live, hers had to die quietly. That was the unspoken agreement. She was not expected to understand it, only to fulfill it. Her father's nod, her mother's silence, the priest's chant, the groom's hand, all of them forming a chain that stretched back centuries. And when she stepped into her bridal sandals, it was not with joy or sorrow. It was with resignation, the kind passed down from girl to girl, like a dress that never quite fits but must still be worn. The bargain was never spoken in her presence, yet it determined everything. Before the veil touched her hair, before the bridal sandals kissed the dirt, a price had already been placed on her future. It was called the dowry. Not a gift, not a blessing, a transaction. In Athens, no girl could be married without one. It was her ticket to legitimacy, to survival, to the illusion of security. Her father calculated it in coin, land, or cloth, weighed against the status of the man who would take her. A generous dowry meant a better match. A better match meant stronger political ties, larger homes, and a steadier path for her children. But for her, the girl at the center of it all, the dowry was a cage wrapped in silk. It determined not only her husband, but the power she would never hold. She would never touch it. The law ensured it remained in the hands of men, transferred like livestock, managed like inventory, recalled only if she was sent back like spoiled goods. For girls from poor families, the dowry was often the difference between marriage and oblivion. A daughter without a dowry risked being left unmarried, and that did not mean freedom. It meant disgrace. It meant becoming a concubine, a servant, or worse, a body used and forgotten, bearing children who would never be recognized. She knew of one girl, older by only a few seasons, whose father had died before arranging a dowry. She had vanished within months, sold to a trader bound for the islands. No one spoke her name anymore. The shame was too great, so the dowry became everything, a symbol of status, a measure of obedience, a silent threat. Even in wealthier homes, where the coin flowed freely, girls were no freer. The size of the dowry increased the weight of expectation. A larger dowry demanded quicker loyalty, more sons, fewer mistakes. It was insurance for the husband. If she failed him through disobedience, infertility, or simply aging, he could return her like damaged property, dowry intact. Her father might protest, but the law was clear. The man who paid for her had every right to change his mind. The girl, as always, had none. On the day of her wedding, she passed through the doorway of her father's home as both daughter and currency. She had been taught to smile, to bow, to remain silent. But she knew, somewhere beneath the painted lids and braided hair, that her life had been traded, not for love, not even for survival, but for the stability of men. And as the songs rose in celebration, she wondered how many other girls had sat like this, dressed in beauty, drowning in value, and wondering if they had just vanished forever. The dolls were still there, lined in a row near the foot of her sleeping mat. One had a missing arm, another wore a tunic made from scraps of old linen. Just weeks ago, she had whispered stories to them, pretending they were queens, warriors, priestesses, anyone but what she was becoming. But the day the midwife noticed blood on her tunic, the dolls were no longer toys. They became reminders of what was ending, of what had already ended. In Athens, a girl's first bleeding was treated as a signal, not a change. It did not begin a slow journey into womanhood. It ended her childhood, sharply and without ceremony. There were no feasts, no songs, only silence and preparation. Her name was now spoken in negotiations, not in games. Her steps were counted, her lessons cut short. The women around her became more distant, more watchful. They no longer spoke to her as a child. They spoke as though she were no longer there at all, only the future wife of someone they had not yet met. Her clothes changed. The soft tunics of youth replaced by fabric stiff with formality. Her hair, once messy and wild, was combed and bound tighter each day. She was taught how to walk slowly, how to kneel without noise, how to serve water without spilling. Her voice was lowered until it disappeared. Her laughter was the first thing she learned to hide. The walls of her home began to feel taller, shadows stretched longer. The songs of the street, once familiar, now sounded far away. She was told to stay inside more often. The world outside belonged to men, to politics and poetry and markets. Inside was her new domain, the kitchen, the loom, the narrow passageways between the courtyard and her husband's room. And yet, even within those walls, she did not belong to herself. She belonged to the city's expectations, to her father's alliances, to the law that named her only in relation to a man, daughter, wife, mother, never simply herself. On the night before her wedding, she looked at her reflection in the bronze mirror. Her eyes were still round with youth, her frame still small. But the veil had already been placed beside her bed, the oils had been prepared, the ritual bath was drawn, and she knew, though no one said it, that the girl she was would not return. She would wake up tomorrow in another man's house, with a new name and new duties. But tonight, just for a moment, she sat beside her old dolls, tracing their painted faces with quiet fingers, not to play, just to remember. There was no announcement, no parchment signed in public view, but the moment she stepped into her husband's home, her identity dissolved. In the eyes of the law, she no longer stood as her father's daughter. She was now her husband's possession, not poetically, not metaphorically, but in the plain and binding language of Athenian law. Her legal status did not exist independently. She could not own land, she could not speak in court, she could not represent herself in any legal matter. She was not permitted to vote or observe the debates that shaped her city. Though she lived within Athens, she lived outside its rights. Her existence was folded into her husband's shadow, stitched into the fabric of his household, like another woven blanket or servant's hand. She was the silent force expected to maintain the home, rear the children, and carry the line. Her name would be forgotten long before her duties were. Her world shrank to the oikos, the private domain of women, while her husband's expanded to the polis, where men shaped history. She was told this was noble, that to serve quietly was honorable, that her modesty protected the dignity of the household, but she knew better. It was not honor. It was disappearance. Even in death, her memory was dictated by men. A gravestone, if granted, might mention her as wife of this man, mother of that boy. Never what she thought, never what she feared. She remembered the first morning after the wedding, the silence in the new room, the way the light fell differently across the floorboards. Her hands trembled as she folded the linens. The housekeeper gave her no instructions. None were needed. Every girl knew what was expected: to obey, to endure, to vanish politely. When visitors arrived, she was to retreat behind the lattice, unseen. When offerings were made to the household gods, her presence was permitted but never centered. Even among women there was a hierarchy: elder wives, mothers-in-law, midwives, all standing above her in age, in knowledge, in power. She, the new bride, was at the bottom. Her thoughts were her own, and therefore dangerous. Better to keep them buried. Better to learn how to speak with glances and movements, with quiet footsteps and lowered eyes. She kept her voice soft, her shoulders down, her desires locked in the small chamber where she slept. The world she had known of fig trees and childhood games, of singing near the well and watching the clouds, no longer existed. The law had closed its gates behind her. Athens did not mourn the loss of her freedom. It never saw it as freedom to begin with. To the lawmakers, to the fathers, to the husbands, she was exactly where she belonged. And for every girl like her, there were hundreds more waiting in silence, practicing obedience, preparing to disappear just the same. The city stood proud on its hills, its marble temples catching the morning light like the crown of a god. Philosophers paced beneath olive trees, debating justice, virtue, and freedom. Citizens gathered in the assembly, raising their voices in votes that would shape history. Athens called itself the birthplace of democracy, but within its grand ideals lay a silence deeper than stone, the silence of its daughters. They were not forgotten by accident. They were erased by design. The laws that governed Athens were written by men for men. A woman could not vote, speak publicly, own property, or shape the course of her own life. She could not choose whom to marry, when to bear children, or what became of her body. She was ruled by fathers, passed to husbands, and buried without her name. Her world was confined to narrow rooms, her value measured in dowries and sons. And yet, this was not seen as oppression, it was seen as order, a necessary structure for the survival of the state. The men who wrote the laws praised discipline and wisdom. They spoke of balance and reason, but they did not ask what wisdom was lost when half the city was forced into silence. They did not question the cost of building a democracy on the backs of voiceless girls. The same city that crowned playwrights for their tragedies could not see the quiet tragedy unfolding in its own homes. There were no statues built for the young brides married before they could dream, no tributes for the mothers who died in childbirth, still barely women, no songs for the girls who vanished behind veils, never to walk the agora or speak their thoughts aloud. They were the invisible foundation bearing the weight so that others could rise. Their suffering was normalized, their silence ritualized, their submission carved into law, and the echo of their absence rings through history even now. We remember Athens for its philosophers, its architecture, its politics, but we must also remember the girls who were never allowed to become women, the children who were made into wives, the minds that were never educated, the hearts that were never asked what they wanted. These were not rare cases. They were the rule, the standard, the system. And the more we celebrate the glory of ancient Athens, the more we must confront the price of that glory, not in myths, not in marble, but in the eyes of the girls who were told, from their first breath, that freedom was never meant for them. If this truth unsettled you, let it. The greatness of a civilization is not measured by what it builds, but by what and whom it chooses to silence.